He was called the father of the automobile. Oddly enough, from a certain perspective, this was true. Of course, we know about a man named Carl Benz and his motor wagon, officially recognized as the first automobile in history. But while Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile as an engineering device, he did more to popularize it than anyone else. It was thanks to him that the automobile transformed from a toy for the rich into an object of universal passion, a means of transportation accessible to everyone. Henry Ford was born on July 30, 1863, in Springfield Township, Michigan, to Irish immigrants. Having made a fortune in logging, they were able to afford a nice house, a prosperous farm, and considerable private land. Thus, the eldest son of William and Mary Liggett Ford grew up well-fed and comfortable. From a young age, Henry showed a keen interest in technology, sometimes to the point of obsession. His younger sisters, there were 8 children in the Ford family, even hid wind-up mechanical toys they gave him for Christmas from him. He would always find them and disassemble them, down to the last screw, to understand how they worked. Then, the young handyman developed a serious fascination with watches, tinkering with complex mechanisms. But eventually, the curious boy discovered a more serious passion. One fine day in July 1876, William Ford, taking his young son with him, set off on business to Detroit. Along the way, the light, 2-seater team of father and son encountered a self-propelled carriage powered by a steam engine. Here's how Henry himself described the encounter. It was a huge steam boiler mounted on wheels, with a water tank and a coal cart attached to the rear. Belts ran from the engine to the rear wheels, which drove the whole thing. Much later, in his numerous memoirs, Ford would claim that this episode was a turning point in his life. It was then that he decided to dedicate himself to the creation of vehicles. Without further ado, at the age of 15, Ford dropped out of school and headed to Detroit, already emerging as the center of America's nascent industry. His first cavalry charge on the future Motor City, however, was not entirely successful. After a brief stint working in a tram car factory, Henry then found work as an apprentice at James Flowers and Brothers. The pay was mere peanuts, but that didn't matter. The important thing was that the young man was free to study hydrants, pumps, steam engines, hoists, and other machinery, of which the company's workshops were littered with countless pieces. All this was great, of course, but Henry was hardly any closer to realizing his childhood dream. He also got married and even returned to his father's house for a while with the beautiful Clara, only to become completely disillusioned with the country lifestyle. Long story short, Ford eventually found himself back in Detroit, this time working for a branch of the gigantic empire of America's electrical king, Thomas Edison. Henry started out as a simple lineman, but in a very short time he achieved impressive success. Within 2 years, he had risen to chief engineer, and his salary doubled to $90 per week. It must be said that Henry had no particular need for cash, and, by his own admission, he joined Edison's company with one goal: to understand the intricacies of electricity. Why? To understand the operation of the auto combustion engine, a cutting-edge technology for the late 19th century in which the fuel mixture was ignited by a spark. Yes, he didn't forget about cars. Henry's inquisitive mind mastered this task, too. And when, on Christmas Eve 1893, Ford's primitive single-cylinder gasoline engine finally started working, the future automobile magnate knew he was ready for the next step. Having assembled a team of like-minded people, he set about building his first car. Ford's talent for alpha leadership emerged at a fairly young age. From then on, his personal magnetism and ability to infect others with enthusiasm and his own, sometimes even wild, ideas became integral to his character. Just imagine, even as an employee at Edison's plant, Henry was more of a manager than an engineer. One worker, devoting his free time to the automobile project of a former line supervisor, put it this way: Mr. Ford himself did practically nothing. He was always giving orders, making suggestions. In any case, the first car was ready in the summer of 1896. Surprisingly, the quadricycle, as Ford himself later dubbed it, proved to be a fully functional example. A belt-driven, 2-cylinder, 4-stroke engine producing 4 horsepower propelled the car up to 30 kilometers per hour. The entire Ford family, including Clara and their son Edsel, would use it for outings in the countryside, surprising the neighbors and scaring the horses. But the quadricycle made an even greater impression on Ford's immediate superior. Automobiles were still a novelty at the time, so the director of the Detroit branch of the Edison Illuminating Company invited Henry to a prestigious party attended by Thomas Alva Edison himself. In the midst of the dinner, America's greatest inventor was introduced to a young engineer from Detroit who had built his own self-propelled carriage. Edison immediately invited Ford to his table and, with undisguised curiosity, began questioning the young man about the quadricycle's design. Without the slightest hesitation, Henry answered all of the light bulb inventor's questions in detail and even sketched a schematic diagram of an internal combustion engine on the back of a menu. "Young man, you're simply brilliant." Edison seemed genuinely impressed. "I believe gasoline engines like these are the future. Hold on to your idea. This is your chance." Henry took the words of his youthful idol literally. His first act was to resign from the Detroit Illuminating Company, turning down a double pay raise and a management position. Within a few months, Ford was settling into the chief designer's chair at the Detroit Automobile Company, the city's first automobile manufacturer. But, as often happens, the initial steps were shaky. It so happened that Henry contracted what we now call star fever. Lavish praise from Edison himself, the boundless trust of influential investors, coupled with his own inflated ego, backfired. Ford felt like a technical genius with the audacity of a free artist, capable of doing whatever he wanted. He became inconveniently fascinated with auto racing and threw himself headlong into building racing cars. Meanwhile, only the occasional primitive truck rolled out of the Detroit Automobile Company's gates, each one bringing the company nothing but losses. The investor's patience proved to be limited, and after several ineffective warnings, Henry was forced to vacate his office. Big deal. Having fallen out with influential businessmen, he immediately seduced new ones, securing funds for the development of a racing car. But this happiness, too, was short-lived. Henry would soon sour his relationships with yet more business partners. He was never known for his docile nature. It's hard to believe today, but at the beginning of the 20th century, there was probably no more odious figure in Detroit business circles than Ford. More famous for his obnoxious personality than his engineering genius, Henry, or rather his name alone, scared off investors and former partners. Anyone who, at the dawn of the new century, would have predicted Ford's destiny as the greatest industrialist of the era would have been laughed at. It seemed certain that this arrogant upstart would never succeed. Indeed, it was a miracle that they managed to secure funding for their next project. With great difficulty, Henry found common ground with coal magnate Alexander Malcolmson, a good friend from his days working for Edison. Malcolmson provided funds for the development of a new model, and on June 16, 1903, the new Ford Motor Company was born. Everyone, especially Henry himself, understood that another such opportunity to make a name for himself might never present itself. Fortunately, fortune finally smiled on the stubborn descendant of Irish immigrants. In fact, production of the first mass-produced Ford, the Model A, began in early June, even slightly before the company's official incorporation. A dozen workers in a rented workshop on Mack Avenue leisurely assembled simple two-seat runabouts with a two-cylinder, 8-horsepower engine. At first, they worked for stock. The company received its first order only on July 15. A certain Mr. Pfennig, a dentist from Chicago, chose a model with an optional top for $850. Then came a second order, followed by a third. By the end of the year, the company would sell 215 cars, and shareholders would receive their first dividends in November 1903, just 5 months after the official incorporation of the Ford Motor Company. And then there was more. By the beginning of 1904, the number of assembly workers would increase more than tenfold, and the total number of cars produced in the first 18 months of the company's existence would reach 1,700. It was an unqualified success. Ford had finally realized his childhood dream. He was producing cars, proving to skeptics that he was capable of more than just arguing and squabbling. Nevertheless, His career thus far had been no different from the fate of hundreds of other relatively successful automobile manufacturers of the early 20th century. But the fact of the matter is that Henry saw far beyond his colleagues. Firstly, he wasn't a big believer in the popular theory that producing expensive cars brings in more profit. On the contrary, Henry had no doubt. The shortest path to success was mass production of inexpensive models. Contrary to popular belief, the first mass-produced Ford wasn't the legendary T, but the Model N, which debuted 2 years earlier. Essentially, it was an experimental car. A highly simplified, if not Spartan, car with a 15-horsepower engine cost just $500. The result: all 8,500 units produced in 1906 sold out immediately, making Ford Motor the largest automaker in the United States. Convinced that the concept of the cheapest possible car worked, Henry and his engineering team accelerated work on a model that, without any exaggeration, was destined to change the lives of millions of people. The Ford N's notorious popularity was due solely to its extremely low price. The car itself, frankly, was poor. With a weak engine, only two-seater seating, and a flimsy frame that lacked rigidity and durability, which, among other things, resulted in a terrible ride. However, for its more than modest price, the Anka was forgiven for its many shortcomings. As the saying goes, it's better to drive poorly than to walk well. And Henry was right. If people are willing to buy a cheap, but not particularly good car, what would happen if we offered the market a car as affordable as the N, but without all its drawbacks? Thus, the Ford T-Class was born. This legendary car is sometimes dismissed as unremarkable in its engineering, but that's not entirely true. Of course, the T-Class didn't impress with its design, super powerful engine, or a host of revolutionary engineering solutions. However, its design was meticulously thought out down to the smallest details, from the reinforced vanadium alloy frame to the engine, which could burn gasoline, kerosene, and even alcohol. In short, it was the world's first well-designed budget car. Consider it the great-great-great-grandfather of today's Logan. The T-Class was inexpensive, but not so much in its execution. Henry added another crucial ingredient to this meticulously thought-out design: a high, or rather, the highest level of quality possible at the time. And this applied not only to the assembly process itself. At his plant, it was a given. Another issue was that Ford's component suppliers were hysterical about the extremely stringent quality requirements for parts, components, and assemblies intended for the Model T. Tolerances for some items reached 4 millimeters, and this, remember, was the early 20th century. On the other hand, Ford suppliers were given exactly the time they needed to develop and fulfill orders, and they were also paid at the highest level. In the first year, approximately 10,000 Model Ts were shipped to customers. In 1911, nearly 70,000 people owned the car, and a year later, that figure had doubled. Even Ford couldn't have imagined such popularity in his wildest dreams. The Model T itself quickly transformed from a successful automobile into a social phenomenon. When it debuted in 1908, the Ford T was rightfully considered the world's most advanced budget car, but as time went on, the model's design remained largely unchanged. In fact, during its 19 years on the assembly line, all the innovations that affected the Tin Lizzie could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Electric headlights appeared in 1915, an electric starter in January 1919, along with a dashboard consisting of just an ammeter, and 6 years later, pneumatic tires finally began to be installed on the T. Everything else was just minor details. But why? Ford, by any stretch of the imagination, couldn't be called a tyrant or an opponent of technological progress. Of course not. It's just that Henry's true passion was always production efficiency. He worshipped this deity his entire life, willingly sacrificing everything, even friendship, to its altar. After all, what is production efficiency? Simply put, it's the greatest amount of output produced per unit of labor. Well, Henry was never satisfied with this ratio. What would any other successful manufacturer, preoccupied with the problem of expanding production, do? Most likely, they'd build another plant, and then another. This approach abhorred Henry. He sincerely believed that another way could be found to produce more, even when production capacity seemed to be exhausted. And, as usual, he was right. Ford's inquisitive mind devised countless ideas. For example, workers in the assembly line were divided into teams, each performing a specific sequence of operations, not on just one, but on several machines at once. This sped up the production process slightly. Then they realized they could save time by delivering the necessary components from the warehouse in advance. This saved a few more minutes, and gradually, step by step, the production rate increased. Furthermore, Ford introduced an atmosphere of constant creative competition at the plant, where every employee could, and even had to, propose their own idea for optimizing the production process. Characteristically, every detail was taken into account. Workers whose ideas were successful received generous rewards. In fact, the introduction of assembly line technology was a direct result of such rationalization proposals. It's believed that the idea for an automobile assembly line came to Henry's assistance during a visit to the Chicago slaughterhouses of Swift and Company. In the meatpacking plant, Ford Motor Company managers were shocked by a scene that was both ominous and captivating. Carcasses hung on chains moved from station to station, where butchers, cleavers at the ready, chopped off the pieces, wasting no time moving from one workstation to another and hardly ever lowering their knives. The efficiency of the mechanized process of butchering hogs astounded the automotive engineers. A similar experiment was decided upon in the workshops of Ford's new Highland Park plant. The assembly of the magneto, a popular ignition system at the time, was split into 2 stages using a conveyor belt. It worked. The time it took to assemble a finished part was reduced by a third from 20 minutes, in man-hours. Gradually, other operations were transferred to the assembly line, first simpler ones, then more complex ones. The engine, gearbox, and suspension were next. Finally, in August 1913, the most complex operation, the so-called marriage of the chassis and body, was automated. Perhaps this day can be considered the birth of the automobile assembly line. The efficiency of these new work methods was unparalleled. Chassis assembly time was reduced from 12.5 hours to 93 minutes. But, of course, these new technologies weren't implemented for the sake of breaking records. Most importantly, starting in 1913, the plant's productivity doubled every year, while the price of a Ford Model T steadily declined, ultimately falling to $260. That's just $3,200 in today's dollars. The automobile assembly line wasn't Henry's only gift to the civilized world. Among other brilliant ideas, this intellectual giant and father of automotive industrialization included, for example, record-breaking wages for his own workers, which not only increased employee loyalty and productivity, but also boosted sales. After all, the wealthy workers became buyers of the cars they themselves produced. Ford not only applied automobile production principles that remain relevant today, he also devised highly effective sales tools. For example, in 1914, to stimulate demand, Henry publicly promised every buyer a $50 discount. More than generous, considering that at the time, the base price of a car was only $500. The genius of this promotion? The money was only reimbursed if Ford sold at least 300,000 cars by the end of the calendar year. Sales that year totaled 308,213 vehicles, and Henry happily fulfilled his promise. In any case, he earned more than he spent. Every time I lower the price by $1, I get 1,000 new customers. Ford said with a chuckle. Even at the turn of the century, Henry realized that one of the essential conditions for efficient mass production was the production of its own auto components. By 1920, the company was producing not only wooden car body frames but also planting forests for future harvesting. Ford understood early on that the key to global popularity was producing cars in different countries and continents. The first foreign branch of the Ford Motor Company opened in Canada as early as 1904. By the time Model T production began, the company had offices in Paris and London, and in 1911, a plant in Manchester opened, the Blue Oval's first assembly plant in Europe. Ford's goal was never wealth. After all, he was born into a wealthy family, but it turned out that money was Henry's oyster. Even before the Model T, He was considered a more than successful businessman, but the Tin Lizzie made him an overnight millionaire. A multi-millionaire, actually. Despite having every opportunity, he didn't live the lavish, luxurious lifestyle so characteristic of those who quickly amassed a fortune. Ford wasn't exactly a recluse and, by and large, indulged in every luxury, but he preferred to spend his money on anything but entertainment. It's hard to say how much Henry's lawsuit with a certain George Selden, an inventor and lawyer best known for his patent for an automobile, cost him. Back in the late 19th century, this American filed a patent for a self-propelled vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine. Moreover, Selden, a legal expert, arranged matters so that anyone who intended to produce automobiles in the United States would have to pay him patent royalties. And everyone paid until Ford said, "Enough." Henry, like no one else, could afford the transfers for this Selden patent. But the very idea of some scoundrel profiting from a patent that was essentially false was repulsive to his very nature. No one believed that the tenacious and stubborn Selden could be overcome, but Ford proved even more tenacious and stubborn. On January 10, 1911, after lengthy and bitter legal battles, the controversial patent was invalidated. Henry's arguably most unsuccessful venture cost him even more. In the midst of World War I, Ford, a lifelong staunch pacifist, paid for the charter of a massive ocean liner. Aboard, he and a group of diplomats and cultural figures set sail for Europe to try to persuade the warring parties to lay down their arms. Needless to say, the expedition failed, and Henry's naivete was subsequently ridiculed by all but the lazy. However primitive his actions may have seemed, Ford's intentions were pure and noble. Again, with the best of intentions, he went down in history as one of the most staunch fighters against labor unions. And Henry's position is quite easy to understand and share. He literally created a system from scratch in which workers and managers had the opportunity to earn a good living if they devoted themselves fully to their work. Ford was convinced that a good worker, like a capable manager, had absolutely no need for a union protector. It is no surprise that Henry found himself at the forefront of the anti-union movement of the 1930s. The automobile giant combated this new scourge with highly specific methods. Henry hired naval officer and boxer Harry Bennett as head of internal security. The 2-meter-tall giant, whom Ford had once saved from prison, was pathologically loyal to his boss and carried out all his orders without hesitation, even those of a highly dubious nature. Unsurprisingly, there were no labor discipline issues at the Blue Oval plants, and those that did arise were dealt with decisively. As the saying goes, a fist and a kind word are more persuasive than a kind word alone. Moreover, attempts by union leaders to force Ford to sign a collective bargaining agreement, which by the mid-1930s had been adopted by all other American automakers, including General Motors and Chrysler, also came to nothing. In the end, what was bound to happen did happen. However, it wasn't reason, the advice of colleagues, or, God forbid, public opinion that compelled Ford to sign the ill-fated document. No, no, and no again. Henry, confident in the correctness of his own decisions, was prepared to break the company into smaller subsidiaries and begin selling off assets rather than bow to the ideals of people whose ideals he had despised his entire life. But his wife intervened. Clara threatened divorce unless her husband preserved the integrity of the company and did everything to ensure that Ford Motor Company remained a Ford family property forever. Only then did Henry, reluctantly, sign the agreement with the hated unions. And what about his highly questionable, to put it mildly, anti-Semitic views? Not to mention the fact that Ford was the only American mentioned by Hitler, and mentioned in glowing terms, in Mein Kampf. But who are we to judge the greatest automaker of the 20th century? There are simply no righteous men in the world of big business, and Ford had already suffered greatly. He outlived his only son. Edsel died of cancer in 1943, and by then he had long since lost all his friends. Who knows, perhaps this is the price this brilliant automaker had to pay for his fabulous wealth and worldwide fame.